The paperwork took longer than the decision. That was always how it went in the quorum. The deciding was quick. A show of hands, a count of lights, a formal nod from Delegate Sur-Ain at the head of the chamber. The deciding was almost nothing. It was the paperwork that gave weight to things. The paperwork that made a punishment real. Velrath of the Eresi sat at his registration console and read the decree aloud to himself. As was required by Quorum Statute 7.4, subsection C, all sentences affecting a species must be verbally confirmed by a registrar before entry into permanent record. He cleared his throat. He read, "By order of the Galactic Accord Quorum, the species designated human, homeworld Earth, solar system Sol, outer arm, having refused repeated directives to decommission their planetary defense armaments following ratification of the Accord peace statutes, are hereby remanded to Cathara for an indefinite period of settlement, said period to conclude upon either voluntary compliance with the aforementioned directives or natural population cessation." He paused there. Natural population cessation. That was the phrase the quorum used. He had always found it elegant, clean. It described the end of a species the way one might describe the end of a rainstorm, as something that simply happened, without blame, without cruelty, as a matter of atmospheric pressure and time. He entered the decree into the registry and moved on to the specifications. Cathara, Class 9, uninhabitable. He had processed 17 Class 9 designations in his 400 years of service, and not one of them had ever required a follow-up entry. A Class 9 was not a prison sentence. It was not even a punishment, not really, not in the way that a fine or a detention was a punishment. A Class 9 was a full stop at the end of a sentence, a period. Nothing followed it. He reviewed the planet's profile as a formality. Atmosphere, nitrogen dominant with sulfur compound saturation at 32%. Breathable by approximately 4 known species, none of them human. The rest would require sealed suits, full respiratory filtration, and redundant oxygen systems at all times. A suit failure of more than 40 seconds meant unconsciousness. A suit failure of more than 3 minutes meant the paperwork would change categories. Gravity. Variable. The planet's 3 moons created competing tidal pulls that shifted surface gravity between 0.7 and 1.4 standard across a 30-hour cycle. Not lethal on its own. In combination with the atmospheric conditions and the terrain, lethal. Falls that would be survivable on a stable world became something else on a world that periodically increased its own gravity without warning. Flora. Extensively documented, none of it benign. The spore fields in the northern continent released a neurotoxin during the planet's dry season capable of inducing sensory collapse in most carbon-based life forms within 6 minutes of exposure. The southern root networks were classified as semi-predatory. They did not hunt exactly, but they grew toward heat signatures, toward warmth, toward living things. 3 xenobotanists had documented this behavior in peer-reviewed papers. None of them had returned to document anything further. Fauna. 3 apex predators, no documented prey hierarchy between them. The Quorum's xenobiological survey teams had spent 11 days on Cathara's surface. On the 9th day, one of the survey teams stopped reporting. On the 11th day, the remaining teams left. Their final report recommended the planet be classified as a Class 9 and left alone. The Quorum had agreed. That had been 60 years ago. In the 60 years since, Cathara had not changed. Planets like this did not change. They simply continued being what they were, patient and absolute. Waiting. Velrath finished his review, set his stylus down, and considered the humans. He had read their file, of course. He made a point of reading the files of every species that came before the quorum on punishment matters. It was professional diligence. He did not enjoy it. He was not the sort of person who enjoyed anything particularly. But he found it useful to understand who he was registering. The humans were, by any objective metric, a young species. Barely 500 years of spacefaring capability. They had come to the Accord late, joined it enthusiastically, and then proceeded to misunderstand its primary condition in what he could only describe as a characteristically human fashion. The Accord required disarmament. The humans had disarmed publicly, loudly, with great ceremony, and then built new armaments privately, quietly, with what their own diplomatic records described as precautionary intent. This was not a defense. The quorum had heard it anyway. Then they had voted. Velrath did not personally agree or disagree with the sentence. That was not his function. His function was to record things correctly, and the record, correctly stated, was this. The humans had been given Kethara. The quorum's xenobiological projections gave them 11 days. The atmospheric models suggested 9. Velrath, who had been doing this for 400 years and had developed a sense for these things, privately estimated 8. The humans would likely spend the first few days trying to establish shelter and communication arrays, which was what species always did in the first days of a Class 9 sentence, and by the time they understood what the planet actually was, the window for doing anything about it would have passed. 8 days, perhaps 9. He set a calendar reminder for 12 days out. He would review the automated extinction log then. He would file the follow-up paperwork. He would close the file. He entered the final confirmation code and moved on to his next case, a trade dispute between the Marathi and the Soln Collective. Something about shipping lanes and mineral rights, the usual. The decree was entered. The record was closed. The planet was waiting. Neither Velrath nor the planet knew yet that they were both wrong about what was going to happen next. The planet because it did not know. Velrath because it had never occurred to him, in 400 years of record-keeping, that sometimes the paperwork came back. The calendar reminder came and went. Velrath noticed it on the morning of day 13, a small blinking icon on his console, flagged yellow for overdue. He had been in the middle of a particularly complicated arbitration regarding Marathi tariff structures and had let it sit. He opened it now. Kethara Extinction Log Review. Overdue. He pulled up the automated sensor report. The sensors on Kethara were standard issue, placed by survey teams during classification, designed to log significant biological events. A reduction in heat signatures beyond a certain threshold would trigger an extinction flag. The system was reliable. He had never had a false negative. He scanned the report. There was no extinction flag. He scanned it again. He checked the sensor calibration readouts. All 17 sensors were functioning within normal parameters. The system was working correctly. It was simply not reporting what it was supposed to report. He ran the biometric log instead. Human heat signatures on Kethara's surface, 212. He stared at that number for a long time. 212 was not a number that made sense. The initial transport had carried 300 humans to Kethara's surface. The expected survival curve for a Class 9 planet was steep and immediate. By day 3, catastrophic losses. By day 7, single digits. By day 11, the automated system would have logged a cessation event and closed the biological record. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. 212 was not a number that fit the curve. It was barely a reduction at all. He checked the transport manifest. 304 humans had been remanded. 212 were currently registering. He did the arithmetic. 92 unaccounted for. He looked for the extinction sublog, the one that recorded individual cessation events. He found it. It contained 14 entries. 14. In 43 days on a Class 9 planet, 14 humans had died. He sat with that for a moment. Then he pulled up the cross-reference against other Class 9 placements for comparison. The Ferrati hive colony of 2,847, 320 individuals. Complete cessation by day 9. The Drell delegation of 2,901, 48 individuals. Complete cessation by day 4. The scattered Weishi communities of 2,934, 200 individuals, scattered across multiple surface sites as an experiment in distributed placement. Complete cessation by day 16, longest survivor to day 19. 14 deaths in 43 days. And then there was the filing. He almost missed it. It was buried in the automated system under a pending review queue, flagged for his attention but deprioritized by the system because it was, technically, a routine administrative matter. He opened it. Galactic Registry Construction Permit Application. Filed by Human Settlement Authority, Kethara. Project description. Permanent water reclamation structure. South Settlement, Phase 1. Classification. Long-term infrastructure. Estimated completion, 90 galactic days. He read it 3 times. Then he filed a formal complaint with the registry's Automated Systems Division, citing a probable sensor malfunction and requesting a full diagnostic review of the Kethara monitoring network. He was very thorough in his complaint. He used precise language. He cited 4 separate technical standards. He thought about the 92 missing humans. He checked the sensor logs again, looking for them. Heat signatures in subsurface locations, perhaps, or in shielded structures that might partially mask a reading. He found some of them that way. They were underground. They had built underground. They had identified, apparently within the first week, that the surface of a Class 9 death world was dangerous, and they had done what Velrath supposed any species might do if they had both the cognitive capacity and the materials. They had gone below it. They had mapped subsurface cave systems. They had reinforced the entrances. There were heat signatures, cooking, he thought, though he was not certain, that suggested they had not merely taken shelter, but had established something. Organized something. He pulled up the xenobiological survey from 60 years ago. The survey teams had noted the cave systems. They had specifically flagged them as a secondary hazard. The cave systems were home to 2 of the 3 apex predator species. The survey teams had not entered them. They had logged the entrance coordinates and recommended in bold text that future expeditions avoid them entirely. The humans were living in them. He thought about the construction permit for a long time. He thought about the water reclamation structure. He thought about the phrase, Phase 1, which implied phases, which implied a plan, which implied that whoever had filed this permit was thinking not in terms of days, but in terms of months, possibly years. He closed the complaint he had filed against the automated systems. He opened a new file. He labeled it Kethara Observation, Ongoing. He began to make notes. They were very precise notes, because he was a precise person, but they were also, and this was unusual for him, notes that he did not quite know how to categorize. He marked the file as active. He booked passage to Kethara. He did not tell Delegate Surin that he was going. This was, technically, within his authority as a registrar. He framed it to himself as a routine site inspection, which was also technically true. He had done site inspections before. He had simply never done one for a Class 9, because there had never been anything at a Class 9 worth inspecting. The shuttle departed 3 days later. He brought his full environmental suit, the one rated for Class 9 atmospheres. He brought redundant oxygen. He brought a week's worth of rations in sealed containers because he was not going to eat anything on Cathara's surface, not under any circumstances whatsoever. He did not know, as the shuttle broke atmosphere, and the planet's sulfur-thick sky pressed orange against the viewport, that he would spend far longer on Cathara than a week. He did not know what he was flying toward. He knew only what his notes said, and his notes said, 212. 14 dead. 1 construction permit for Phase 1 of a permanent water reclamation structure. The record showed something that the record had no category for. He was going to find out what it was. The shuttle set down in a clearing that had not been a clearing 60 years ago. Someone had made it one. The southern tree line, the semi-predatory route network that the survey teams had flagged in their final report, had been pushed back 40 meters from the landing coordinates. Not burned, not cut. Pushed back. Velrath studied the route line from the shuttle's exterior camera before he suited up. The routes were still alive. They simply stopped at a precise boundary, as though by agreement. He checked his suit seals 3 times. He descended the shuttle ramp. The air outside registered immediately on his atmospheric sensors, sulfur compounds at 31%, slightly below the planetary average, which he attributed to local topography. Breathable, technically, for perhaps 4 known species. He was not one of them. The suit's filtration system hummed steadily. He watched his oxygen readout and tried not to think about what 31% sulfur would feel like on unprotected skin. The settlement was visible from the landing site. This, too, was unexpected. Class 9 surface placements were not supposed to produce visible settlements. They were supposed to produce, eventually, a log entry. What he saw instead was a collection of low structures arranged in a rough oval around a central open space. The structures were made of something dark, the cave stone, he thought, or a composite of it. They were squat, deliberately squat, lower than they needed to be, and he understood after a moment that the reduced profile was intentional. Less surface area, less exposure to the atmospheric variance, less target for the gravitational shifts. They had engineered their buildings around the planet's behavior. He was still processing this when a human came out of the nearest structure and walked toward him. She was not wearing an environmental suit. She was wearing what appeared to be a jacket. Thick, layered, with some kind of lining that caught the orange light oddly, which suggested a reflective or insulating material, and trousers that had been reinforced at the knees and shins with something that was definitely not the original fabric. Her hands were bare. Her face was bare. She was breathing Cathara's air directly, and she was walking toward him at the pace of someone who was in no particular hurry and had nowhere better to be. She was carrying a bowl. She was eating from it as she walked. Velrath checked his atmospheric sensors again. Sulfur at 31%. He watched her breathe. She breathed normally. He made a note and immediately questioned the note, because the note would require him to explain in an official document how a human was breathing 31% sulfur atmosphere without apparent distress, and he did not have a category for that either. She stopped a few meters away and looked at him, then at his suit, then back at him. "You're from the Quorum," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am Velrath, Galactic Registrar, 4th category. I am conducting a routine site inspection of—" "Are you hungry?" she said. He looked at the bowl. The contents were orange, roughly the color of Cathara's sky, with dark red pieces of something distributed throughout. It smelled, even through his suit's external microphones, like something that had been cooked deliberately rather than something that was simply warm. "I have my own rations," he said. She shrugged and kept eating. "Suit yourself. The walk from the cave access takes about 20 minutes if you want the full tour. Or we can start here." She gestured at the settlement with the hand that wasn't holding the bowl. "Most of the above-ground structures are workshops. Living quarters are mostly below. We found the cave network around day 6. The survey teams from 60 years ago noted that the cave systems contain 2 of the 3 apex predator species on this planet's surface." "Contained," she said. Past tense. He waited. "They den there in the dry season," she said, not looking particularly concerned about this. "We came in during the wet season. By the time the dry season started, we'd been there 2 months. They came back, and we were already there." She ate another spoonful of the orange substance. "There was a period of about 3 weeks that was complicated. But they're not territorial. Once they understand you're not prey, they're mostly interested in the root fauna in the lower cave levels. We stay out of the lower levels. They stay out of ours." "You negotiated a territorial boundary with apex predators." "We stopped bumping into each other in the dark," she said. "I don't know if I'd call it a negotiation." "Mara." She held out her free hand. He stared at it. Among his own species, physical contact with an unknown individual was a formal gesture requiring prior agreement. He did not know the human convention. He took her hand. She shook it once, firmly, and let go. "Velrath," he said again. "I know, you said." She turned back toward the settlement. "Come on. I'll show you the water reclamation structure. Phase 1 just went operational yesterday. The permit is still pending, but I figured we'd build it and sort out the paperwork later." That is not how permit processes function. How long does a permit usually take? For permanent infrastructure, averaging processing time across species and location, approximately 120 galactic days. "And how long does it take to die of dehydration?" He did not answer. She nodded as though he had. He followed her into the settlement. He kept his suit sealed. He kept his oxygen monitor visible on his wrist display. He watched everything with the careful attention of someone whose entire function was to observe and record. And what he recorded was this. The structures had gardens. Not agricultural plots, not survival cultivation, not the desperate scrabbling at soil that he had seen in accounts of stranded colonies on marginally habitable worlds. Gardens. There were things growing in containers between the buildings, plants from Earth, some of them, in sealed hydroponic units, but others that were not from Earth. Others that were from Cathara, things that should have been toxic. Things that the survey reports had specifically categorized as inimical to carbon-based life. Growing in pots, next to a door. He stopped walking. "Those plants," he said. Mara glanced back. "The red-stemmed ones. Those are actually edible if you process them right. Takes about 3 hours, and you have to boil off the upper compound layer. But after that, they're fine. A bit bitter. We add the root salt." She paused. "That's what's in the bowl, mostly." She had been eating Cathara. She was eating the planet that had been given to her species as a method of erasure, processed and salted and carried in a bowl while she walked out to meet a quorum registrar, and she had offered him some. He followed her to the water reclamation structure. It was well built. It was better built than it had any right to be, made from cave stone and salvaged shuttle components, and something that turned out to be a resin derived from a Cathara plant that, when processed correctly, was apparently waterproof. She had been on the planet 43 days. He stood next to the structure and looked out at the settlement and the pushed-back root line and the gardens and the low stone buildings. And he thought about the word settlement, which was the word the quorum used for where species went when they were being punished. And he thought about how that word had always felt temporary to him, a holding pattern, a waypoint before the extinction log. She was not surviving Cathara. She was on speaking terms with it. He did not know what to write in his notes. He wrote the dimensions of the water reclamation structure instead. He wrote them very carefully. He wrote them 3 times because precision was important, and because if he was writing dimensions, he was not thinking about the bowl. The census took him 3 days. He had expected it to take 1. The human settlement was not large. 212 registered signatures, accounting for the 90 he had originally thought were missing but were simply underground. And a standard biometric census should have been a matter of hours. But every time he moved to a new section of the settlement to complete his count, something else required notation, and the notations expanded, and he found himself, on the evening of the 2nd day, sitting in his shuttle reviewing 12 pages of field notes and trying to determine which of them were relevant to an official report. He was not sure any of them were. He was not sure any of them weren't. The total population of the settlement was 212 adults and 23 children. The children were the detail that kept pulling at him, that he kept returning to in his notes, that he had written down and then underlined and then bracketed as though the brackets might help him make sense of them. 23 children had been born on Cathara. This meant that in the 43 days since remand, the quorum had transported the initial group. Subsequent arrivals had come on volunteer transports, which was its own impossibility that he had set aside to deal with later. 23 humans had been born on a Class 9 death world. He was aware that human gestation periods were considerably longer than 43 days, which meant these children had been carried here, had been born here, and had spent the entirety of their lives so far on a planet that the quorum's survey teams had considered too dangerous to walk on without writing their final wills first. He watched them from across the settlement's central space. They played. He had seen children play before. It was not unusual behavior. What was unusual was where they played, and how. The central space was hard-packed cave stone, flat and level, and children ran across it and called to each other in the human way, loudly, immediately, without apparent concern for who heard them, and they seemed perfectly content. But what caught his attention was a child at the far edge of the central space, perhaps 6 years old, maybe 7. He was not well calibrated for human ages, who was doing something on her own near the northern boundary of the settlement. She was approaching a spore cloud. He was moving before he had consciously decided to move, one hand going to his suit's external alert system, and then he stopped. She stopped too. At the boundary. At precisely the boundary, not beyond it, not close to it, exactly at the outer edge of the dispersal zone where the cloud's neurotoxin concentration dropped below the threshold he had on his own sensors. She crouched down. She was not retreating. She was looking at something on the ground near her feet. She picked up a piece of stone and made a mark in the dirt with it. He watched her. She did not seem afraid. She seemed interested. He recalibrated his initial reading. She was not fearless. He had seen fearless, or rather he had seen the absence of appropriate fear response, which was a different thing, a dysfunction, a failure of the systems that kept a species alive. This was not that. She knew exactly where the line was. She had walked to it with the confidence of someone who had measured it before and confirmed it many times. The mark she made in the dirt was not new. He could see, as he came closer, that there were older marks there, a progression of them, documenting the boundary at different points, possibly at different times of day, or at different phases of the spore cloud's dispersal cycle. She was mapping it. She looked up when he was about 10 meters away. She looked at his suit, then at his face through the visor. She did not seem alarmed by either. "You can come closer," she said. "It doesn't bite here." He stood where he was. "Suit yourself," she said, which was exactly what Mara had said about the food, and he wondered if it was a human expression or something they had learned from each other in this specific community, this settlement that had no business existing, and he decided it was probably both. "How do you know where the boundary is?" he asked. She pointed at the marks in the dirt. "I mapped it. It moves a little at midday when the wind comes from the west, but mostly it stays in the same place." She paused. "The little ones know not to cross the marks. We taught them." "How old are you?" 8, she said. He thought about that. An 8-year-old human, born on this planet, who had spent her childhood mapping the neurotoxin dispersal boundaries of Cathara's spore fields so that the younger children would know where it was safe to play. He sent his daily report to Delegate Sur Ain that evening. He did not include the child in the report. He was not sure how to include her. He included the census numbers instead, and the operational status of the water reclamation structure, and a note that the settlement appeared stable and that further observation was warranted. He kept the language clinical. He kept the language the way he always kept it: precise, measured, free of anything that might require someone else to feel something they weren't prepared to feel. Delegate Surin's response came back the following morning in one sentence: "Increase atmospheric sensor sensitivity. There must be an error." He sat with that response for a long time. Then he walked back out to the central space and looked for the girl with the stone and the dirt map. She was there again, crouched at the same boundary, making another notation, checking her work, being methodical about it. He thought about the phrase "natural population cessation" and how clean it had seemed when he had read it aloud in the quorum chamber, how efficiently it had described something without describing it, how comfortable that efficiency had been. The record shows he had written for 400 years. He wrote the same thing again, but he left the sensor sensitivity settings where they were. The memorial wall was on the eastern side of the settlement, built into the base of the cliff that marked the beginning of the cave network entrance. It was easy to miss if you were not looking for it. Velrath had passed it twice during his census work without understanding what it was. He had noted the stone slab and the markings on it and categorized it as a structural notation. Settlements sometimes marked their foundation points, survey benchmarks, load-bearing assessments. He had logged it and moved on. On his 4th day, Mara took him there. She did not tell him she was taking him there. She had said, at the end of the morning, "Come." In the flat, unceremonious way she said most things, and had walked east, and he had followed. He understood what it was when he was close enough to read the marks. Names. 31 of them, in human script, and in 2 other writing systems he did not recognize, carved into the stone with what must have been considerable effort. The stone of Kithara's cliff face was not soft. Someone had worked at these names for a long time, individually, each letter deliberate, each line clean. He stood in front of the wall and read what he could read. He counted what he could not. 31 names. He had logged 14 deaths in his Cathara file. He thought about that discrepancy, and then he understood. The others were from before the automated sensors had been fully calibrated to track human biosignatures. The earliest deaths, the ones in the first 2 weeks, when the sensors were still reading them as a background biological noise and had not flagged the cessation events. 31 names, in 43 days. He said, because it was the only thing he could think of to say, The stone is acid-resistant. Yes, Mara said. Cathara's surface stone usually has a higher sulfur absorption rate. This is different. Where did it come from? The lower cave levels. She was looking at the wall, not at him. We found a deposit about 140 meters down. Takes 2 people to carry a piece this size. Took us a week to get it up. A pause. We wanted something that would last, something the planet couldn't take back. He thought about what it would take to carry a piece of stone 140 meters out of a cave system that housed apex predators across the surface of a Class 9 planet to build a wall for the names of your dead. You could have left, he said. She looked at him. He clarified. The Quorum's remand procedures include 3 voluntary relocation windows in the first year of a Class 9 placement. They are rarely accessed because... He stopped. Because species in Class 9 placements generally do not survive long enough to access them, was what he had been about to say. They were available to you. The first window was at day 15, the second at day 30. There is a third at day 90. I know, Mara said. You were aware of the windows? Mara Ose, Settlement Authority Keth Ara, she said, reciting it like a filing name. I'm the one who submits your forms. I read everything that comes in from the registry. She looked back at the wall. We talked about the first window, at day 15. We had 8 dead by then. We talked about whether to go. What was the outcome of the discussion? She was quiet for a moment. Not an evasive quiet. A remembering quiet. Daniela Ferreira thought we should go. She made a good case. She said the planet was killing us faster than we could learn it, and that was just math, and you can't argue with math. She paused. Daniela is the 3rd name from the top. He looked at the wall. 3rd name from the top. Daniela Ferreira. Carved with the same care as the others, with the same clean, deliberate lines. She died at day 19, Mara said. Spore exposure. She had wandered outside the mapped boundary. We hadn't finished mapping it yet. That's why Inez started doing it systematically. Inez is the one who makes the dirt marks near the spore cloud. And the wind shifted and she was too close. She stopped. She was the one arguing to leave, and she died before we voted. He did not know what to say. We voted anyway, Mara said, even after, because she would have wanted us to. She turned slightly toward him. We voted to stay, 11-9. And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like 11 people decided Daniela died for a reason, which is the kind of thing you tell yourself when you need to get through the next day. Maybe it is that. She looked at the wall again. But it's also true that the people who voted to stay had already started to understand something about this planet. That it wasn't trying to kill us specifically. It was just what it was. It didn't know about us. It was going to keep being what it was, whether we were here or not. And we could leave and find somewhere that was slightly less likely to kill us, or we could stay and learn everything we could about what it was, and figure out how to live inside it. He was quiet for a long moment. That is a difficult calculation. Where would we go that's safer than a place we already know how to grieve, she said. The words came out simply, without drama, the way she said most things, as though she had turned them over many times and had come to them from the far side of a long consideration, and had found them to be simply true. He looked at the 31 names, carved into acid-resistant stone, carried up from the deep caves, because they had wanted something the planet could not take back. The planet had taken 31 people. They had taken the planet's stone and made it keep their names. He did not write anything in his notes that evening. He wrote 14 drafts. The first was clinical. Biosignature census, 212 confirmed individuals, settlement infrastructure, permanent, multi-phase construction. Survival rate at 43 days of remand, 90%, accounting for the 31 deaths logged against a starting population that had grown due to voluntary arrivals on subsequent transports. He had verified this. People were choosing to come to Cathara. People who had not been sentenced here were reading about it on human communication networks and requesting transport, which was a detail he had included in Draft 1, and then removed because he could not find the correct form category for it. The 7th draft was Draft 5 with different formatting. He sent it. Delegate Suran's response arrived 6 hours later. Thank you for the update. Confirm sensors calibrated. Recommend withdrawal from site. Your presence may be affecting human behavior. Return when population reaches projected terminal phase. He stared at that response for a long time. Projected terminal phase. The phrase assumed that there would be one. It assumed that the curve he had expected to see, the catastrophic early losses, the dwindling signatures, the final log entry, was still coming, had simply been delayed by some anomaly he had not yet identified, and that if he stopped interfering by observing, the planet would complete what it had been assigned to do. He did not respond immediately. He opened his private notes file, the one he had started on his first day, the one labeled Cathara Observation, the one that contained 12 pages of things he could not put in an official document, and he read back through it. He had written, "Settlement structures display adaptations to gravitational variance. Low profile, flexible internal divisions, no rigid load-bearing in upper levels. Species appears to have identified and responded to the planet's behavioral patterns within the first week of remand." He had written, "Memorial wall constructed from cave source acid-resistant stone. 31 names. Carried 140 meters by hand." He had written, "Child, approximately 8 years old, mapping neurotoxin dispersal boundaries with systematic methodology. Older marks visible beneath current marks, suggesting ongoing revision as conditions change." He had written, "Mara Ose, Settlement Authority, eating Cathara." He closed the private notes. He opened a new draft. He wrote without stopping. The record shows that the human settlement on Cathara is not in a survival phase. A survival phase implies temporary endurance against conditions that remain hostile, pending either relief or cessation. What the record actually shows is a settlement in an integration phase, active learning of planetary systems, structural adaptation to local conditions, establishment of long-term infrastructure, and social accommodation of loss without departure. The quorum gave them a prison. They are building a home. He stopped typing. He sat with that sentence for a long time. He thought about the word home, which in Iresi had a legal meaning, a registered domicile, a formally acknowledged location of primary residence, a place that existed in the record as yours. He thought about how differently the word seemed to function among humans, who used it for places that had cost them greatly, places that had taken things from them, places they had stayed in, not despite what had been lost there, but somehow because of it, as though loss was a form of ownership that the registry had never thought to document. He thought about Daniela Ferreira, third name from the top, who had argued to leave and had died before the vote, and been carved into acid-resistant stone by the people who had voted to stay. He thought about what it meant to be given the worst place in the galaxy as a punishment, and to look at it and decide, 11 to 9, to learn its name. He deleted the draft. He saved it to the private file. He labeled it Draft 14. He told himself he would decide later whether to send it. He opened it again at what the human settlement called 3 in the morning, by their reckoning, which was a time of the night cycle when the planet was quietest and the overhead sky was briefly free of the sulfur haze and the stars were visible. He had not looked at stars through an unmediated atmosphere in a long time. He had always done his work inside, with regulated air and proper lighting, and a console between himself and the things he was processing. He read draft 14 again. He did not delete it again. He looked at the stars through Kethara's briefly clear sky. He made his decision in the morning. The question had been building for several days. He had not asked it immediately because it was not a registrar's question. It was not the kind of question that belonged in a field report or a census log, or any of the 14 drafts he had written and sent or saved or deleted. It was a personal question, and Velrath had not asked a personal question in his professional capacity in 400 years, because personal questions led to personal answers, and personal answers were things that happened to other people. He asked it on the morning of day 8 of his visit, while Mara was doing what she called checking the perimeter, which meant walking the outer boundary of the settlement and noting anything that had changed overnight: the position of the root network, the drift of the spore cloud, the overnight behavior of the soil composition sensors they had placed at intervals around the settlement's edge. He walked beside her. She did not seem to mind. "What does Kethara look like in the quorum files?" she said. It was not a question either, the way she said it. She said it the way you say something you already know the answer to but want to hear from someone else. "Class 9, he said. "Uninhabitable. Sentence world." She nodded slowly. She was looking at the route line as she walked, checking the distance markers. "When we first arrived," she said, "I spent the first 3 days trying to find somewhere familiar, some feature of the landscape that looked like something I knew. Most people did that, I think. It was a way of managing it. You look for a hill that looks like a hill you remember, or a way the light falls that reminds you of an afternoon somewhere else. You make connections." She paused to note something on her handwritten log. She kept a physical log, on actual paper she had brought from Earth, and he had found this almost as remarkable as the gardens. "There's nothing familiar here. The sky is the wrong color. The plants grow wrong. The ground shifts. You can't find anything to connect to, anything to map onto something you already know." "That sounds difficult," he said, because it seemed like what was expected. "It was for about 3 days," she said. "And then I stopped trying to find something familiar and started paying attention to what was actually there. And what was there was—" She gestured at the landscape in a way that seemed to encompass all of it: the orange sky, the root network, the spore cloud at the settlement boundary, the cave mouth visible in the cliff face. This, just this, exactly as it was, which was complicated and toxic and trying to kill us in several specific ways that we could, if we were careful, learn and work around. He said, "Why didn't you leave?" It came out flatter than he intended. It was the question underneath the other questions, the one he had been carrying since the memorial wall, and it came out without ceremony. Mara was quiet for a moment. They had reached the northern edge of the settlement, the point where the perimeter walk turned back toward the cave entrance. "My grandmother's house flooded every year," she said. He waited. "Not a little. A serious flood. Water through the ground floor, sometimes the second floor, everything below a certain height, ruined. It happened every rainy season without fail. She lived in Lagos, on the coast, and the flood engineering in that part of the city was—" She shrugged. It was what it was. Not enough, for a long time. She looked at the cave entrance. "Every year the water came, and every year she and my grandfather rebuilt whatever the water had taken. They built the ground floor on raised supports after the 3rd year. When that wasn't enough, they added another floor and moved the living space up. When that wasn't enough..." She paused. When she died, she was living on the 3rd floor of a house that had started as a 1-story bungalow. It had been rebuilt so many times, around and over and through itself, that nothing of the original structure was left except the foundation stones and the doorframe, which she had kept because she said the doorframe was the part that mattered. He thought about foundation stones. He thought about doorframes. She called it the best house in Lagos, Mara said. He understood then. Not the settlement. He had understood the settlement as a phenomenon, a series of decisions that could be traced and documented. He understood the thing underneath it, the thing that Draft 14 had almost touched, that he had saved to a private file and opened at 3 a.m. and not quite been able to look at directly. They didn't call it home because they were stuck there. They didn't call it home because they had decided to make the best of things, which was a phrase that implied resignation, which implied that the thing they had made the best of was not what they would have chosen. They called it home because they had chosen it. Because you chose things that cost you. Because a place that had taken something from you was a place you were owed a debt by, and a debt was a kind of connection, and a connection was a kind of claim. They had 31 names on an acid-resistant wall. They had a doorframe they had kept because it was the part that mattered. I don't have a category for that, he said. He meant it as an admission of a professional limitation, a gap in the registry's classification system. It came out differently. It came out as though it were the truest thing he had said on Cathara. She looked at him. I know, she said. You'll figure one out. His bioluminescence dimmed almost to nothing. He did not try to control it. He was not sure, in that moment, that control was the appropriate response. They walked back toward the settlement in silence. Cathara's orange sky held the morning light the way it always did, patient and total and indifferent to whether anyone down below understood it. The root network held its boundary. The spore cloud held its position, mapped and marked and known. Velrath had lived 400 years, and he had spent them in chambers with regulated air and well-lit consoles, and the comfortable certainty that what he recorded was what was real. He had never stood on a Class 9 planet before. He had never had to. He had no category for grief that builds. He was going to have to create one. He filed the reclassification request on a Tuesday. This was, in galactic terms, irrelevant. The Galactic Registry did not observe human days of the week, and neither did Velrath, not formally. But he had been on Cathara long enough that his internal schedule had begun to approximate the human settlement's rhythms. And the settlement observed Tuesdays because it was a human settlement, and humans had brought their weeks with them, the way they brought their paper logs and their door frames. It seemed, in an unofficial way, like the right day to file something that was going to require an explanation. The reclassification form for a Class 9 designation was long. It had been long specifically because the original designers of the registry system had not expected it to be used often. A Class 9 reclassification had never been filed before, as far as Velrath could determine from the registry's historical records, and so the form had been written with the detail appropriate to a thing that was not meant to need to exist. He filled it in carefully. He cited the census data. He cited the infrastructure assessments. He cited the memorial wall, which he described in the form's cultural notation field as permanent stone memorial, acid-resistant material, constructed by settlement community, listing 31 named individuals who died during the establishment phase of the settlement. He cited the gardens. In the classification field, where the registry offered a drop-down of existing category options, he scrolled through all 347 available classifications. None of them were correct. He scrolled back to the top. He selected the manual entry option, which required administrative supervisor approval and a written justification of at least 500 words. He typed, in the classification field, "Settled." He wrote the justification. It was 1,012 words. He did not have trouble filling it. He had been writing it, in one form or another, in 14 drafts and 12 pages of private notes, and 3 in the morning looking at stars for the past week. He submitted the form. He sent a copy to Delegate Sur-Ein. Delegate Sur-Ein did not respond. This was not unusual. Sur-Ein had stopped responding after Velrath's third field report, and Velrath had come to understand that the silence was not bureaucratic delay, but something else. The particular silence of someone who had signed a document they had never expected to think about again, and had found, to their considerable discomfort, that it required thinking about after all. 3 other members of the quorum requested copies of the reclassification filing within the week. He sent them. 2 responded with procedural questions about the justification length. 1 responded with a question about the gardens, specifically the Cathara plants growing in containers, specifically whether they were still toxic in their unprocessed form, specifically whether the humans were aware of this. He replied, "Yes, yes, and yes, the 8-year-old who maps the spore clouds is fully aware. She has been eating the processed variety since approximately day 20, and her biosignatures remain within normal human parameters." He did not receive a follow-up question on that particular point. The morning he left, the sky was clear. This happened sometimes on Cathara, he had learned. Brief windows in the morning when the atmospheric sulfur content dropped, and the haze lifted, and the sky was something other than orange. He had seen 3 such mornings in his time on the planet, and he had spent all 3 of them outside, which had alarmed him the first time, and had become, by the third, something he looked forward to. He stood outside his shuttle on the landing pad, the clearing that had not been a clearing 60 years ago, that someone had negotiated with the route network to make. And he looked at a sky that was, for 30 minutes, the color of the sky above his office on the quorum station, which was a regulated blue-gray chosen specifically for its neutrality and its lack of character. Cathara's clear sky was a different color. He did not have a precise notation for it. Mara was in her garden when he walked to say goodbye. She was planting something in the soil between 2 of the hydroponic containers. Not in a hydroponic unit. In the soil, in the Cathara ground, which should not have been able to sustain the root structure of a plant that had evolved on Earth. She had been amending the soil for weeks, he knew, adding minerals, adding processed organic matter, asking the planet, patiently and methodically, to accommodate something new. He watched her for a moment. She noticed him and looked up. "Filing complete," she said. "Filed and transmitted." He paused. "The reclassification will take time to process. There will likely be procedural challenges. The quorum does not adapt its classification systems quickly." "We'll wait," she said. She pressed something into the soil with 2 fingers and covered it over. "We're good at that." He nodded. He looked at the garden, at the cave entrance behind the settlement, at the memorial wall, visible from here, the names in their acid-resistant stone. He said, because he had decided he was going to say it, and had been a registrar for 400 years, and had been careful for 400 years, and intended to be careful again tomorrow, but not right now. "The quorum gave you this planet as a punishment. I want you to know that I understand what you did here is not what they intended." She looked at him. Her expression was not angry, which was what he had half expected. It was something else, something that on her face looked like the same expression she had when she talked about her grandmother's house in Lagos. "What did they intend?" she said. He did not answer. She knew the answer. He knew she knew. "We know what they intended," she said. "We also know what we did." She turned back to her garden. "Those are two different stories. Only one of them is going to last." He walked back to his shuttle. He ascended the ramp. He sealed the door and ran his pre-flight checks and filed his departure notification with the automated system, which received it and logged it without comment, as automated systems do. In the Galactic Registry, in the field that had previously read Keth Ara, Class 9, Uninhabitable, Sentence World, it now read Keth Ara, Settled. Below the official fields, in a section labeled Registrar's Notes, which was technically an informal annotation space for preliminary observations pending formal categorization, a space that Velrath had used exactly twice in 400 years, both times for minor procedural clarifications. There was one line, handwritten in the scanned copy, the only handwritten thing in his 400 years of record. The quorum has no further jurisdiction over things that are loved. The shuttle lifted. Kethara fell away beneath him, orange and patient, and entirely itself. The sulfur haze closed over the cleared sky as the morning window ended. The settlement was visible from altitude for almost a full minute before the clouds took it. The low stone structures, the gardens, the cave entrance in the cliff, the cleared landing pad, the memorial wall facing east. Then the clouds closed, and there was only the planet. And the planet did not look like a prison from up here. It looked like a place someone had decided to stay,